All right, joining us now, member of the House Intel Committee, Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. Also with us, legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, Maya Wiley, and managing editor at the Washington Examiner, Jay Caruso, joins us. Good to have you all.
So, Congressman, let's start with you. Wall Street Journal story broke yesterday. They're just, forget, who needs White House tapes? Who needs a Nixon? We got emails. Got emails of Sondland emailing the chief of staff, emailing everybody around the president saying, hey, great news. The investigations are going to move forward. I expect we're going to hear a lot about that this week. What's the implication of that?
Yeah, you are going to hear a lot about that this week. Last week was 3 extraordinary diplomats testifying. America saw what the State Department is made of. This week is really, and I think the centerpiece is likely to be Ambassador Sondland, right? Because what happens this week is, the question is, if I can riff a little bit on that famous question from Watergate, you know, what did the president say and who did he say it to? Because other than the transcript, which is there for everybody to read, we don't know the background conversation. So now we got a couple of people who can talk about that. And of course, you know, it's kind of interesting on these emails, right? The president is refusing to provide any documentation, State Department refusing to provide emails, all these documents. Now apparently the Wall Street Journal is getting them. So that's going to, I think, corroborate the case that this president was very clearly holding up aid and a meeting in exchange for these investigations.
Maya, talk about this past week, last week. I thought just substantively, it was an extraordinary week, day after day after day. And whoever is setting this up is doing an extraordinarily skillful job, it seems to me. And now we're coming into week 2 with this new Sondland evidence right before Sondland shows up on Wednesday.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Joe. I mean, the cadence of the week that I thought was so pivotally important was the fact that the story of the primary national security issues of the country became much more vividly clear than it had when we were only reading deposition transcripts, right? I mean, so the witnesses, starting with Bill Taylor, were really able to say 13,000 Ukrainians have died. This isn't a theoretical issue about national security, and start to explain what the national security issues are and the implications of holding up not just the aid money. I mean, I think this is important. We keep talking about whether it's a quid pro quo related to actual military aid, but making very clear how pivotally important for national security even the meeting with Donald Trump and Zelensky was to send a signal to Moscow that the U.S. was standing beside the Ukraine. And that, I think, is such an important setup to the notion of abuse of power for personal gain against the interest of the United States. That's what sets the foundation for impeachable. And that's why this coming week is so important, to your point about Gordon Sondland, because he is now the person, as we know from what we've heard about the deposition Friday afternoon, that had direct conversations with Donald Trump. So starting to erode the plausible deniability that the president wasn't directly involved.
And his memory is evolving.
And you know, a lot of people are talking about arms for dirt, quid pro quo. As Maya said, when you strip it all away, what this is about is the undermining of America's national security.
Absolutely.
That simple. He undermined America's national security for his own personal benefit.
And I mean, the word, you know, using the phrase quid pro quo, I mean, another way of describing it might be extortion or bribery. It's a crime. And obviously there's a focus on the crime, Congressman, but there are so many categories of news happening as this all plays out. And I'm thinking of the president live tweeting about the former Ukrainian ambassador as she is testifying. I mean, clearly witness intimidation at the very least. Is that fair to say?
Well, that continued through the weekend, attacking other witnesses that were going to be testifying in the future.
Yeah, and look, we should be clear about that. Apart from the damage done in Ukraine, which may not be felt by your average American in Pennsylvania, you know, all that intensely. Yeah, Vladimir Putin is watching this very carefully. And what Vladimir Putin is saying is that the president of the United States will go way out of his way to accommodate not the American national interest, But the Russian interest, and this is really important, right? Not necessarily for Ukraine, although that's pretty important, but this is important about what Putin thinks he can get away with vis-a-vis NATO, vis-a-vis what's next after Ukraine in the Middle East. And yeah, Nikki, you're exactly right. Look, I know we're having this long debate about extortion versus bribery versus... Bottom line, bribery is when I pay you to do something corrupt. Extortion is where I threaten you into doing something corrupt. Frankly, in my opinion, it's both.
It is both.
Hey, Jay, Jonathan Lemire, I wanted to get your take on sort of the Republican reaction to what was a pretty devastating week for the president as the first couple of days of the hearings rolled forward. There was one moment where Congressman Radcliffe, after one of the sessions, reporters came up to him and tried to ask him a question, and he whipped out his phone and began talking into it, even though, according to the reporters, the home screen was visible, and there was certainly no call in progress.
Oh, I've done that walking through airports. It's all right. Yeah.
I did that on the way in this morning when Barnacle came up to me.
Everyone
but I wanted to get a sense.
That's where I learned to move.
But I wanted to get a sense as to what you're hearing, as to what Republicans thought about last week, and what their approach might be this week as Gordon Sondland, Alexander Vindman, who I don't think we should overlook, testify in the next couple of days.
Well, I think what you saw so far, what you saw last week, was a lot of muddying of the waters, and that's what I think Republicans are going to want to continue to do. It is very easy to completely dismiss what happened, but it's not plausible. So what you do instead is you kind of, again, you muddy the waters. You say, well, this is second and third hand information. And now when it comes down to the person who's there, they're going to say, well, then they'll go to extend it to, well, that doesn't matter. These are bureaucrats. They don't get to set policy. The the president of the United States gets to set policy. They will continue to kind of like work around the underlying facts in a way where they can kind of cloud the issue and essentially kind of keep the polling at this, where we see right now is this kind of this split, this 50-50 throughout the country. And if they can keep it there at that level, then they know that it's not going to get to a point where there's going to be hardly any Republicans who are going to convict in the Senate. And then you may even have a concern about whether or not they'll actually file articles of impeachment. So that's going to be the Republican strategy going forward. Even with Sondland, we'll see they'll try to undermine what he said, the things that he said, or take a stance where it's not a big deal what he did or what the president did.
So on Jay's point, Maya, just a straightforward question. Is the conclusion here basically foregone, right? Impeachment and acquittal in the Senate. It doesn't seem like there is anything worse or more terrible that could come out in these hearings. The basic outlines of what happened.
Do we know that?
It's possible, but let's say the basic outlines.
But hold on a second. You never know what's going to happen in a trial. You never know what's going to happen in hearings. Nobody could have guessed what was going to happen in Watergate.
But watching these last 2 weeks, right, what we've seen is that the basic story hasn't changed. It just gets more and more detailed, right?
Oh, but the details are critical. So I'm actually with Joe on this one, because think about Friday. Well, first of all, I think many of us, or at least I, thought it will be useful to hear from the ambassador, but not that mind-blowing, right? But Donald Trump's own behavior actually undermined the Republican efforts at defense. If you remember the Republicans' press conference after, they literally had to dodge the question about Donald Trump's tweets. They couldn't even respond in real time to what those tweets meant because they were so abhorrent. And then we find out the thing we didn't know, which was that there was going to be evidence of a phone call between Sondland and Trump on July 26th, the day after. None of us knew that evidence was going to come out on Friday until it came out. And now we're hearing that there are 2 additional witnesses to that call we haven't even heard from. So I think as Neil Katyal says in his tweets, drip, drip, drip. These drip, drip, drip is going to possibly turn into a flood. We don't know, but I think it is, if we have learned anything from this process, what we have seen, Wall Street Journal emails, where did those come from?
Well, exactly.
State Department.
People are talking.
People are coming forward despite what I would call, we can call it witness intimidation. It's abuse of power of the presidency to use his public Twitter to basically send a message for folks to obstruct Congress. That's a constitutional violation, in my view. So all of these things total up to we don't know. So you could be right, Nick, but I think we've seen enough to know we don't know.
Do we know more about this phone call from David Holmes, who I guess did a private deposition on Friday?
Yeah, no, I wasn't in that deposition, so I can't comment on what he said. But I think Maya's point is exactly right. I mean, if these open hearings have been characterized by one thing, and this surprised me, it is that there have been surprises, right? So, you know, on day one, I guess it was, when Ambassador Taylor comes forward and says, hey, you know, my aide overheard this phone call with Sondland. We didn't know that. This now turns out to be one of the centerpieces of this thing. And there's an interesting dynamic going on right now. You talk about the emails coming out and people coming forward. You know, if you're in D.C. and you're sort of listening to these people and talking to these people, a lot of people watch what that whistleblower did. Now, I know the Republicans are hell-bent on getting the whistleblower in for reasons that escape me, right? I mean, everything the guy has said has been corroborated.
Yeah. Well, it's actually worse.
Yeah.
Or it's worse. Said. They actually should try to get him to register Republican because he actually made things better for Donald Trump because, as John Meacham said last hour, if he had not revealed this when he did, then Donald Trump would have actually kept extorting the Ukrainians to a degree that the situation would have been far worse. 4 more people would have died in Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And my point was that people are now looking at the whistleblower. They're looking at Bill Taylor. They're looking at Marie Yovanovitch, who, I mean, if you were in that room, my God, she was just exuding courage and nervousness. And a lot of people are saying, wait a minute. What's my responsibility? If people who are, you know, relatively junior, apparently in the intelligence community, will risk everything to stand up for their country, there's a lot of people saying, what's my responsibility? And that is not a good moment for the President of the United States. No.
Congressman Jim Himes, thank you very much. And Maya Wiley, thank you as well for coming on this morning. And coming up, President Trump's ascent to the Oval Office generated excitement among America's business leaders. But poor policy choices have now pushed CEO confidence to the lowest level in a decade. Our next guest explains why Trump is bad for business. Next on Morning Joe, we'll be right back.
Morning Joe is sponsored by the Lincoln Wish